Okay, great. So the first thing about essays that I want you guys to notice, although I highlighted 2012B, I want you guys to take a minute and just with me go through each of the questions from 2011 onwards. So 2011, and of course, I can show you the top, but 2011 I think is indicative of the type of questions that come. And that's why I start there. But just to read 2008 to you guys as well, where the only circumstances are that residential accommodation is offered and accepted with exclusive possession for a term at a rent, the result is a tenancy. Elaborate the statement and consider the extent to which it provides a useful guide for distinguishing a tenancy from a license. This should sound familiar. You did not do this question, but it is so similar to one of the questions we've done before, which was about, one of the questions I think we did together, which was about the 3 characteristics of a lease and what the importance of each of those factors was. So here, they're telling you the 3 factors, so they're not going to expect you to respond with a long and lengthy discussion. Oh, this is what the 3 factors determining if an agreement is a lease are. They're going to expect you to go into a lot more depth about each factor, because you already are given the factors in the question. So this question is, the only circumstances are that residential accommodation is offered and accepted with exclusive possession for a term at a rent. They're saying if you have these 3 things, then you have a tenancy. And you guys know a tenancy is essentially a lease. There's, of course, slight differences between a leasehold estate, a lease being a strict agreement or document, and then a tenancy being the nature of the relationship between the lease holder, as in the lessee, and the lessor, right? So I want you guys to always remember that you can use tenant interchangeably, and if you decide to differentiate between a lease agreement and a leasehold estate, then that's just, more points and better clarity for you. The more clarity with which you answer your questions, the better it's going to be for you, because you don't have to say like, oh, hey, I know the difference between a leasehold estate and a lease agreement. But if you use the 2 separately and you use leasehold agreement correctly and you use leasehold estate correctly, the examiner will know that you understand these subtle implications of each term, right? But anyway, that aside, that's just a general comment. Specifically on this question, they're giving you the 3 factors. They want you to discuss the 3 factors and whether or not it's a useful guide for distinguishing a tenancy from a license. Now, I will retain this position throughout, but I'm going to say it up front so you guys keep it in mind for all of the rest of them. Where they're asking for your opinion, give them your opinion. When they say consider the extent to which it provides a useful guide, they're saying, do you think it's useful? My reaction is always, it is not a useful guide. The reason being, and this is something we've discussed at length, that rent is technically optional. You can have a tenancy technically without any rent at all. And even the idea of term has become so redundant due to the recent case law, reinterpreting a lot of agreements with ambiguous terms, that one might even say that term is not a useful factor either. And therefore, your concluding statement and your introducing statement would be something to the extent that it's no longer a useful guide. While these 3 factors were at one point considered to be essential characteristics of a lease, maybe this needs to be revisited. Okay, so this is just your general introduction, and I want you guys to keep this in mind as we go through the rest of them. So 2011 is a much more pointed version of the exact same statement. Proof of exclusive possession is all that should be required for the parties to establish that a lease has been created. To what extent, if at all, do you agree with this proposition? This is basically the thesis statement of the last question, is it not? It's what I just said. Term, not really necessary. Rent, strictly not necessary. And exclusive possession being the only main factor. This could be your thesis for all of the essay questions on leases. Almost always, they will expect you to come to this conclusion, not because they want you to give the same answer across the board, but because they know that to a large extent, a lot of the case law and a lot of the textbooks point you in this direction. If you read the judgments in leases, they expect you to come to the same conclusion. You don't have to, but they expect you to. Does somebody have a question? Okay, the next one, critically assess what is meant by exclusive possession in determining if there is a lease. Should exclusive possession be all that the law requires for the existence of a valid lease? Already, do you see the pattern? Again, they're fixating on exclusive possession. So when they say, should it be all that the law requires, they're implying that they want to hear about what else the law requires. Because currently, this is not the only thing that the law requires. So they're saying, should it be? Should we remove the other factors? So they're going to expect you to tell them, what are those other factors? They're going to expect you to mention term and rent, and then focus on exclusive possession. So if you want to prepare a leases essay, and I strongly recommend it because leases regularly come as essays, and even if you don't prepare it as an essay, anything that you learn when preparing for an essay will be extremely valuable for answering a leases prop. Therefore, I will always suggest preparing a leases essay with special attention on the subsection that deals with exclusive possession. That is going to be your key to getting an easy distinction in a leases essay question. The only thing that you'll have to do if you want to get going above and beyond is look at any recent developments about specifically exclusive possession and lease versus license distinction, and maybe look at some other commentary and just drop that in there while you're explaining your answer. It's not necessary. The reason being that it's already such a controversial subject, lease versus license distinction, that there's a lot in your textbook to begin with. So even if you just cover the basis by reading that subsection and being very familiar with the relevant case law, you're good. That's why I always say leases essay, great idea, okay? The next one, although identifying the legal distinction between a lease and a license is straightforward, applying the distinction in practice has proved far more problematic. Here, they want you to talk about the Street and Mountford thesis and say, yeah, it's theoretically very useful, but in reality, because of the way that the courts view things like term and how they don't think that it's uncertainty of term is actually good enough to disrupt a perfectly otherwise valid lease, it's in practice not considered useful at all. And rent is the opposite situation where you would say that technically it's not allowed, but the courts to a large extent have started to say, well, it's really hard to imagine why anybody would let their property unless they wanted to make money. So they expect you to sort of talk, and here you might talk a little bit more about recent case law than you would about the foundational Street and Mountford. But otherwise, 90% of your essay is going to be exactly the same. The next one, ample scope for improvement and simplification. How far do you agree with this assessment of the essential legal characteristics to create a lease? And B, the legal principles relating to forfeiture for breach of a leasehold covenant, other than the one for the payment of rent. So this one's slightly different because it brings in leasehold covenants. This was a bit of a curveball because honestly, you don't normally get leasehold covenants mixed into the same question. But that being said, there's still a lot that you can do with this because of the fact that they're just, all they're saying is reforms. How can we reform the legal characteristics of a lease and forfeiture as it relates to leasehold covenants? Now, I don't think you guys did leasehold covenants with Sir Adil. So, or did you? Yeah, so just as far as it relates to the first half of the question, what I would say is you would just need to talk again about the recent cases and how you think that they could be improved or simplified. Now, they don't want you to give them random ideas for reform. They expect you to be somewhat prepared to give some sort of a suggestion based on what other people say, right? So there's always suggestions for reform in the book. We don't spend a lot of time talking about them just because it's so hard for us. We're so pressed for time to cover the entire syllabus as it is. But while you are preparing questions, I strongly recommend looking for things like reform, because this is a question that's going to focus entirely on reform, right? So whereas, for example, the earlier lease license questions were just asking like, is exclusive possession good enough? Is it sufficient? Are the others even necessary? This one is asking, well, where would you go in the future? So this would be a little bit less of a focus on the past, more of a focus on future reforms. The next one, even though the approach established in Street and Mountford to determine whether exclusive possession exists is less important today, it is workable and sensible for single occupiers. It has, however, proved to be problematic when it comes to cases involving joint occupiers. So, do you think establishing exclusive possession should be enough for a valid lease to exist? This is a twist on the classic question. It still largely deals with exclusive possession and will easily be something you can answer as long as you focus on exclusive possession when you're prepping leases. But that being said, the reason I say it's a little bit of a twist is because they're going to expect you to handle those specific cases which deal with multiple people entering into a lease at the same time, right? And so, do they have the four unities present? Can you really say that this is a leasehold, estate if two people, for example, signed the agreement at different times? And what if they are married? What if they are not married? What if one individual leaves? Will the rent still have to be paid by the other? These are the characteristics of a jointly occupied lease, right? And so, sorry, one second. And so one of the things that I'm going to expect you guys to focus on, or that they would expect you guys to focus on, is basically whether or not, there needs to be a distinction, right? Or if we should get rid of exclusive possession altogether in favor of sort of a new reformed approach to defining what a lease is or isn't. Remember, by the way, just as an aside, one second. Sorry, guys. I don't remember where I was, but we're basically, the bottom line was that I want you guys to focus on the cases that deal with jointly occupied leases, right? The next one, this should sound very familiar because this is one of my favorite questions when it comes to leases. I think I assign it every single year because it is a very well phrased quote, and all they're saying is discuss. So the reason that I think this is a good question is because it's very open-ended. They expect you to take ownership of that quote and to feed it back to them with your analysis, right? So what I would always recommend doing is breaking down this question into three parts, right? And that's going to be the identifying of each of these elements. So which one is entirely unnecessary, which one is technically necessary, and which one can be avoided by the draftsman or court's sleight of hand. And which one is absolutely necessary? The second one is both, right? So what I would recommend, and remember, never make the mistake of thinking that it's in the same order. One of the things they said in the report was a lot of people were like, certainty of term is entirely unnecessary, exclusive possession is technically necessary but can be avoided, and rent is absolutely necessary. A lot of people did that because certainty of term came first, so they thought that that was the one that's entirely unnecessary, and so on and so forth. Don't make that mistake. Don't fall for these traps. Always keep it in your mind that you know exclusive possession is the one that's absolutely necessary, and you know that term is technically necessary, and rent, is literally not. It's given in the statute that it's not necessary, right? So that being said, they expect you to use that much of your brain power to identify which one is which. But more than anything, they expect in a question like this for you to bring the quote up again and again. Why do I say that? How can you give a specific answer to a question that's the same every single year? They expect you to refer back to the quote, right? So the reason that I pick this question is because the quote is very interesting. So you would tell them entirely unnecessary may be an exaggeration. And then you'll give your generic statement, and then you'll be specific again. You'll say, it is in fact unnecessary, But in certain situations, in certain limited situations, you might say that it is actually, apparent. It is actually relevant, right? And so the reason that I say that is because you're bringing up the quote again and again. The same way that if this were a prop question, you would be bringing up the people in the prop question again and again. You're bringing up the elements of the quote again and again, right? So the other thing that you would be bringing up is you would say, it's technically necessary that you have to have term. But how can you avoid it? You can avoid it by having an open-ended, or you can by having an open-ended term that is tied to an event. But the court, you can ask the court, or you can tell the court to interpret it in such a way that it falls into one of those exceptions where it could actually be turned into a lease for life, terminable upon an event, which would then in turn be interpreted as a 99-year lease, and so on and so forth. I'm not getting into those details right now because I assume that you guys are with me, and if you're not, don't worry, we'll cover it when we get to the prop. But please tell me you're with me. Please tell me you're with me. I just feel like leases is the chapter that we did the most together, so I hope that you guys know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so yeah, so that's how they would expect you to say like bring up technically necessary again and again, bring up the sleight of hand part of the quote again and again. Okay, you're good. Whew. I'm glad. And then for the last one, the same thing with absolutely necessary. This is what they're going to expect you to spend a lot of time on. And so how would you bring this up again? You would say it's not always sufficient, because just because you have exclusive possession, does that mean you automatically have a leasehold estate? If exclusive possession alone gives you a leasehold estate, how does that work when it comes to a jointly owned property, right? Then it gets a little confusing. Do we have a lease or do we not have a lease, right? So even then, it's not sufficient on its own, right? I always like to think of this quote as depicting when, the ingredients for a cake. I think this is the same analogy I gave you guys before when we talked about this question. If I tell you that I'm making a cake, and there's three ingredients, right? Flour, butter, and eggs, right? Or do I say butter, or do I usually say sugar? It doesn't matter. But what you would say is a cheesecake, yes. I would say cheesecake, except cheesecake, there's so many different types of recipes for cheesecake that, like, I don't want to go down that road. Because, there's no-bake cheesecake, and then there's, like, cream cheesecake, and then there's, anyway. So what are the three ingredients that we always use when we have a cake? Flour, butter, and eggs, right? Hopefully you use sugar, but technically it's not necessary. But anyway, my point was that of these three ingredients, there's always going to be one that you always need. That's flour. I make a great flourless chocolate cake, but we're gonna pretend that there's no such thing as flourless cake right now because it's only really chocolate cake. And the cocoa powder acts as a flour, so technically it's still flour. Anyway, so you always are gonna need flour. That is exclusive possession. You cannot make a cake without some kind of flour type of agent, which is there. Yes, I agree with you completely. Anybody who has cake without sugar, like, come on. But, I knew like some people who were like, oh, I use applesauce. I'm like, anyway, flour, you always need flour. Eggs, technically you need eggs, right? Technically you want to have eggs. They act as a binding agent, but it's a lot easier than you would think to make a cake without eggs. It's perfectly possible, and you won't even be able to tell. So eggs is one of those things which is technically necessary, but it can be avoided by the baker's sleight of hand, right? So if you're clever about it, you can get around it. You can't get around not using flour. So the last one, butter. Did you guys know you don't need butter for a cake? Like, if you have it, great. You do not need butter for cake. You usually, in fact, cakes are often made better with vegetable oil. I know it sounds kind of gross, but like it gives you a smoother cake at the end. But my point is that, a lot of people are so used to thinking that you need butter, the way that we're so used to seeing rent when we have a lease agreement, that there's this assumption that you require butter in your cake, but you don't. Technically, if you go by the book, as in the statute, if you go by the book, butter is not listed as an ingredient. Usually some kind of a vegetable oil is listed as an ingredient. Yeah, I'm so hungry, by the way, so I'm with all of you guys. I'm not making biscuits. I'm just saying, try, like, layers. Somebody just mentioned layers. Layers, I don't think they use butter. I say this because as somebody who had like a huge passion for baking once upon a time, butter is a very temperamental ingredient, and it can actually throw off your cakes a lot if they're not at the right temperature, if it's not the right quality of butter, whereas vegetable oil is consistent and it gives your cakes a certain type of consistency. And believe you me, they are more moist with vegetable oil. So that's why when I say layers doesn't use, like, yeah, so that's me too. That's why when I say layers doesn't use butter, like, pakka, I will like bet you money on this. Not money, I'll bet you a layers cheesecake on this. Although, by the way, they don't have the best cheesecake. I make the best cheesecake. And where was the other really good cheesecake I had? Somebody here recommended it. Masoom's, I think. But anyway, we're not going down that road again. I'm starving. I haven't eaten since breakfast. But yes, I agree with you too, Hassan. And thank you, Tabin, for confirming that cake is better without butter. Yes, yeah, I think a couple of people recommended Masoom's. It's really good. Nando's cheesecake wasn't bad. I had it once, but it was not that great. But I'm telling you guys, I make a better cheesecake. I just don't have the time to. Anyway, back to LEASES. My point is, when they talk about 3 ingredients for a cake or 3 ingredients for LEASES, I want you guys to deal with each one the same way you would deal with ingredients for a cake. Similarly, I mean, if you guys aren't into cakes, but you're into, like, I don't know who's not into cakes, but you're into like cars, I don't know. You need an engine, right? And technically you need like a body, but if you like Jeeps, then you don't always need a body, right? Then you just need like a bits and pieces of a body. Like I've seen people in Lahore driving around, like, you know, nice weather with like these bare bones type of cars, like Jeeps. They don't even have a top or a sides, right? So technically you don't need a body. And what's the last thing that you definitely don't need? I don't know, a windshield or whatever. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you like definitely need fuel, but you don't really technically need, no, you don't actually technically need fuel, because now we have electric cars. Anyway, I'm going down like a road that I can't, that I can't really keep up with. But that being said, yes, we can go. You got it with the cake, so that means we can go back. That was Saba's way of saying, can we go back to the LEASES question? Am I describing a cycle? Yes, it does sound like I'm describing a cycle, actually, that's true. But anyway, yes, one day when I make my YouTube channel, it's never gonna happen, knowing how lazy I am, but not lazy, busy. I promise I'll share my cheesecake recipe. I'll also share this recipe for this great cake I make, which is like a tres leches cake, but like better than tres leches cake. It's not lotus though. I also make this really good like chocolate braid is my husband's favorite. So I'll share that too one day. Anyway, back to work. LEASES. So this is how, when I say discuss 3 factors, discuss them the way that I'm discussing these 3 ingredients with so much passion. Like you want to give more time to flour so you can really get into it. And you want to make sure that they know what the 3 ingredients are. Yes, Sajal, I am. I'll send you the tres leches. I will. Just email me. It's a recipe I got offline, and then I just made a little tweaks. So anyway, back to work. What I was saying was, give it the same amount of attention the way that I'm giving a lot of attention to the things that I love, which is food, cakes in particular. Not biscuits, but cakes. I don't like biscuits. Who calls them biscuits anyway? Cookies. Okay, so the next question. You guys, I'm just gonna show you these last 3 because they're similar all together on one part of the screen. And it's just the same exact theme, right? Even though the approach established in Street and Mountford determine whether exclusive possession exists is less important these days, it is workable and sensible for single occupiers. Wait, did we already do this one? What is butter here? That's a great question, Misal. Butter is rent. It's technically not. It's actually not necessary at all if you look at old recipes. It's oil that's necessary in old recipes. Like it's written like you don't use butter. You don't need rent. But we're just so used to seeing butter. Anyway, so it has, however, proved to be problematic when it comes to cases involving joint occupiers. Oh, would you look at that? It was the example. Oh, repeated this question. 16 was a little bit different. There seems little enthusiasm or rationale for the certainty of term requirement in leases. So this is interesting because they're trying to make you focus on a slightly different topic, on a slightly different element, but don't be fooled. When they say there's little enthusiasm for certainty of term, they want you to spend the majority of your time discussing that whole trick that they came up with about interpreting any ambiguous term as a lease for life and then terminable upon the occurrence of an event, which would then be converted into a 99-year lease, and so on and so forth. This is what they want you to focus on, yes, but they still want you to discuss why you have these other two factors and what their relevance is or isn't. So it's almost like, they just want you to hear, they want to hear a little bit more about eggless cakes, like vegan cakes, and a little less about flourless cakes and how you can't have flourless cakes because they're basically just really floured cakes. Oh yeah, my flourless chocolate cake recipe. That's even better than my cheesecake recipe. Okay, so in Street and Mountford, the House of Lords assured us that a valid lease has 3 elements: certainty of term, exclusive possession, and rent. And again, look, it's the exact same. I don't know if I repeated it, or I think at one point they did repeat the same question. What was up there was 2016 in the resit exam. I think they gave the exact same question in a proper exam, like in the next cycle. So it's very possible that they will repeat. So I think that's what had happened in this situation. And so you guys have seen now the entire range of all of the essay questions ever given on leases in the last 11, 12, 13 years, right? So it took 13 years, I say one day, I promise, one day. It took 13 years for us to be able to see that they are definitely following a pattern. What does that tell you? That tells you if you want to do well on a leases essay question, you only have to focus on one thing. Honestly, that's exclusive possession in leases. Honestly speaking, it's a gamble. Yes, you might get a question like this one, which is about certainty of term, but you're already going to know enough to score really well because of the fact that you went so in depth on exclusive possession, right? The key, however, to scoring really well will always be referring back to the quote and giving specific opinions throughout your essay question. All right. So, like I said, we'll switch over to a prop question, but it is a single rule across the board when it comes to leases essay questions that I want you guys to focus your entire essay on these 3 elements and their relevance today. It's not about where did these 3 elements come from, why were they relevant in the first place, what is the historical case law concerning this, none of that, no. It's now, how do courts talk about these different elements? Why are we no longer in favor of elements such as term? How do we interpret rent, given that it's so common that it should be necessary, but technically it's not necessary? Do we suggest that that definition of a lease is changed? Do we say that there shouldn't be rent at all? Or do we say that because rent is such an essential element of a lease, it should actually be as important as exclusive possession? These are all questions that we've talked about, but we've never really gotten answers for them. The reason is they want you to give your own answers. They expect you to be able to give an opinion. If you are an expert at something, you should be able to give an opinion on it. So for example, let's say that I am a baker. If somebody walks up to me and they say, what do you think about flourless chocolate cakes? I can probably talk about it for a lot longer than somebody who's never made a cake in their life. So they expect you to know your subject so well that if somebody asks for your opinion on it, you're able to give it. So whereas, for example, I don't know that much about It's not much I don't know much about. But I'm not gonna say I don't know much about cars. I know a lot about cars, but I don't know, like, I'm not like a car mechanic, so I'm not like an expert on cars. So if somebody came up to me and they said, well, what do you think is the difference between like the Honda Civic and the Honda Civic Turbo? I'd probably be like, I think that one's better, but I wouldn't be able to tell you why. So they don't want you to do that with your leases question. They don't want you to tell them that exclusive possession is totally necessary and rent is not. No, they want you to tell them why. Why isn't it necessary? Because you're such an expert, we want to know your opinion. There's no right or wrong. You could go in there saying that the most important element should be term, and that exclusive possession is actually completely redundant because of the way it doesn't work with jointly occupied tenants, jointly occupied tenancies. And you could not get graded wrongly for that. They will not penalize you as long as you express a well-reasoned opinion. That's all it takes, okay? So trust yourself in giving your opinion as long as you've read the material. So while we're on that, I'm just going to show you guys, I know that this is the previous version of the book. It's just because it's my own marked up version that I keep using it. But I think the pages are generally similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're generally pretty similar. So I'm just going to really quickly tell you which subsections they were before I switch over. Yes, it is starting with 6.2, which is in my book on page 219, and I feel like your books are like 3 or 4 pages off. So page 219, you're gonna memorize every word of 6.2.1, which is exclusive possession. And when I say memorize every word, that includes the footnotes. You would not believe how valuable the footnotes in the Dixon textbook are. They have a lot of the case laws contained in the footnotes, and a lot of the sort of like, sorry, one second. That being which material about exclusive possession? If you don't get it, just ask me, and I'm very happy to explain it because I feel like it's a chapter that we can get through pretty quickly. But just really quickly, so 6.2.1, I would expect you guys to know every single word of it, including the footnotes, but more so the end of 6.2.1. So you'll notice, and it's funny because it's how obvious it is that they love exclusive possession, that one of the 3 factors is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pages long on just exclusive possession, half a page on rent, or the 1 page on rent, and 2 pages on certainty of term. That alone tells you how much of your essay, 70% of your essay should be about exclusive possession, because 7 pages exclusive possession, 2 pages certainty of term, 1 page rent. 10%, 20%, 70%. Okay? Keep that in mind when you're prepping. Know all of the footnotes, but focus on the last couple of paragraphs for exclusive possession, because the last couple of paragraphs are the ones that really get into the idea of a non-proprietary lease. Or a Bruton lease, and that's something that we've discussed. Hopefully you guys remember. It's this concept that you can technically get a leasehold estate out of a license. Really sort of strange creature of Lord Hoffman's imagination. But that being said, they want you to give an opinion on it. Be prepared to give an opinion on it. Be prepared to know this section of your chapter in depth. Imagine just memorizing these 7 pages will guarantee you an almost perfect answer, whether the question is an essay or a prop. Okay? I'm going to end this class because it's 40 minutes, or almost up. We're going to start a new one, and then we'll just get straight into, yes, I saw your questions. I'll just address them in the next one, and then we'll get straight into a prop in the next one, okay? Proprietary estoppel we can definitely discuss, and if there's any confusion, we'll talk about it in a bit.